Hello, this is Dr. Angela Wright. I'm lecturing in the School of English, and today I'm going to take you through the slides for my second lecture for LIT107, studying prose on Ann Radcliffe's Sicilian Romance. This is a lecture with a PowerPoint to replace a Thursday the 6th of November lecture. Okay, I'm going to start with giving you the structure of the lecture that I'm about to give to you, which is on slide 2 of the PowerPoint. And basically today, having talked to you yesterday about the revolution and the institution and how the Gothic critiques institutions in the wake of the French Revolution, today I'm going to take you through a Sicilian Romance in relation to some key connected things. First of all, I'm going to expand upon comments I made yesterday about Shakespeare and how it is used in Ann Radcliffe, and look again at that epigraph to the novel I Could a Tale Unfold. And then I'm going to go on to talk to you about one particular thing that epigraph raises, and talk to you about the aesthetics of terror in Radcliffean Gothic fiction. And then move on from that to think about where the true terror resides in a Sicilian Romance, and talk you through the gender relations in the novel, and then consider the marriage in it and escaping the yoke. So those are my key points today, and I'm now moving on to slide 3 to talk about terror in a Sicilian Romance. Now, the Romantic critic Nathan Drake, who wrote many interesting essays during the Romantic period, referred to Ann Radcliffe as the Shakespeare of Romance writers. And in slide 3, I've put for you the epigraph that is taken from Shakespeare's Hamlet in full and used at the beginning of a Sicilian Romance, and I'll just take you through that now. A Sicilian Romance gives you a very short epigraph, I could a tale unfold. And here I've given you the full context of that from Shakespeare's Hamlet, Act 1. But that I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison house, I could a tale unfold, whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood, make thy two eyes like start from their spheres, thy knotted and combined locks to part, and each particular hair to stand an end, like quills upon the fretful porcupine. Now this is Hamlet's ghost, the ghost of Hamlet's father, who's speaking here in Act 1 of Hamlet. And I think that what's interesting about this is the ghost of Hamlet's father encounters his son on the ramparts of a castle. And basically he wants to tell him the tale of how he is unlawfully murdered by his brother. But it's a way that he actually focuses upon the physiology of terror. A tale whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood, make thy two eyes like start from their spheres. This is a very physiological response to a tale of terror. And I think that it's interesting that Radcliffe uses this as her epigraph from Shakespeare, because clearly she wants to make our young blood freeze, our eyes to start from their spheres, and our hair to stand on end with the tale that she gives us here. Now, moving on to slide 4, in relation to terror, there was a great commentator upon the idea of terror and the sublime in the 18th century called Edmund Burke. And in his very long titled A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, Edmund Burke actually tried to define what terror was and what the sublime was. And he said, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which a mind is capable of feeling. Now, Burke defines the sublime as being the strongest emotion which we can feel. The sublime is something that is associated with pain, our eyes starting from their spheres, in the words of Hamlet's father's ghost. But when we experience the sublime, we also experience an expansion of our imagination. And that expansion of our imagination acts as we respond to terror, as we look down the corridor of a castle, as we imagine what terrors await the heroine in the abbey where she seeks refuge. This is when we experience terror and its companion feeling the sublime. So terror is absolutely key as an aesthetic to Ann Radcliffe's fiction. And as I put in slide 5 of the lecture PowerPoint, it's something that she herself endeavoured to define later in her career when she said in an essay that was published posthumously that, quote, "Terror and horror are so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. The other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them. And where lies a great difference between horror and terror, but in the uncertainty and obscurity that accompany the first, respecting the dreaded evil?" Well, what Radcliffe is distinguishing between there are two key emotions that we ourselves experience. Horror is something for Radcliffe that freezes and nearly annihilates our faculties. It's where you can see every imaginable thing laid out in front of your eyes. A horror movie is very different, for example, from watching, say, a movie by Alfred Hitchcock, where you experience real frisson of terror as you watch a villain stalking his prey. Now, Radcliffe keeps name-checking the word terror in A Sicilian Romance. Her lovely governess, Madame de Menon, who is a gentle confidant of the two sisters, Julia and Amelia, experiences anxiety and terror as she imagines what has happened to Julia when Julia leaves the castle. And here on slide 5, I've given you an example of how terror is used in relation to the imagination of Madame de Menon. It says, "But Madame's utmost endeavours were unable to express the anxiety with which the uncertain fate of Julia overwhelmed her. Wild and terrific images arose to her imagination. Fancy drew the scene, she deepened the shades, and the terrific aspects of the objects she presented was heightened by the obscurity which involved them." Now, what's key here is that when we don't know something, when something is kind of shaded or obscure, say we don't know what awaits us at the end of a particular corridor or in a graveyard or something, that's when our imagination operates and actually makes us experience terror very fully. And Radcliffe gives us here a key example of how Madame de Menon, her governess, experiences terror. Now, moving on to slide 6, I want to ask a key question for A Sicilian Romance, I guess, and that is, what is the terror held within the castle of Mazzini? Because as I've written in the slide, there is no real ghost here, but rather there is the spectre of a disastrous and tyrannical marriage. Julia discovers her mother, who she believes to have died when she was a child, imprisoned in the vaults of a castle. And she's just not recently been imprisoned, she has been there for years and years. Louisa, the mother, when Julia discovers her, actually tells a woeful tale of a tyrannical husband who imprisons her. Once When midnight increased the darkness of my prison, she recounts, and seemed to render silence even more awful, touched by the sacred horrors of the hour, I poured forth my distress in loud lamentation. Oh, never can I forget what I felt when I heard a distant voice answer to my moan. A wild surprise, which was strangely mingled with hope, seized me, and in my first emotion I should have answered the call had not a recollection crossed me, which destroyed at once every half-raised sensation of joy. I remembered the dreadful vengeance which the Marquis had sworn to execute upon me if I ever by any means endeavoured to make known the place of my concealment. And though life had long been a burden to me, I dared not incur the certainty of being murdered. I also well knew that no person who might discover my situation could effect my enlargement, for I had no relations to deliver me by force, and the Marquis, you know, has not only power to imprison, but also the right of life and death in his own domains. Now, what Julia's mother describes here is optimism that is absolutely crushed by dreadful vengeance. The fear of being murdered by her own husband, because her husband, in the feudal system, had the right of life and death in his own domains. Surely this story at the end of the novel is in many ways more terrifying than any ghost, because what it tells us, and this is me moving on to slide 7 now, is that marriage quite literally can be lethal. Gothic literature literalises the plight of women in late 18th century society, and as the critic Ruth Bienstock Anolik puts it, metaphors take literal form in Gothic fiction. There was a legal law that I mentioned at the end of my lecture yesterday called Coveture, and Coveture basically entailed the loss of female identity on marriage. It was closely related to the law of primogeniture, and primogeniture in some ways is still in place today, and it focuses on the oldest son as being the inheritor of a family name, title and fortune, so that money and rank is passed from father to son, son to son, and so on and so forth. Now, in a Sicilian Romance, this truly is the real source of terror. Marriage can be lethal, and it's not only the story of Julia's mother that relates this to us, it's also the story from much earlier on of the governess Madame de Menon, because she tells a tale of her own sad marriage on pages 33 to 4, and her marriage is one that, after the premature death of her husband, she is denied by her husband's brothers. Thus, she writes, was I derived of these proofs which were necessary to authenticate my claims to the estates of my husband. I was therefore at once abandoned to sorrow and to poverty. Madame Menon has been a noble woman in her own right, but men, and more specifically her husband's brothers, have actually denied her of a legal right to inherit her husband's estates upon his premature death. Now, moving on to slide 8, this is relevant to the story of Giulia di Mazzini for several reasons. Giulia, as I discussed yesterday, is almost forced into marriage by her father, who wishes, through her marriage, to strengthen his own financial interests. And it's interesting the way in which this is cast, because the Marquis's response to his daughter's refusal to marry his friend is interesting. On page 56, as I've put on slide 8, what, he says, when wealth, honour and distinction are laid at my feet, shall they be refused because a foolish girl, a very baby, who knows not good from evil, cries and says she cannot love? let me not think of it. My just anger may, perhaps, outrun discretion, and tempt me to chastise your folly. Attend to what I say, accept the Duke, or quit this castle for ever, and wander where you will. Saying this, he burst away, and Julia, who had hung weeping on his knees, fell prostrate upon the floor. And it's interesting that what the Marquis of Mazzini emphasises is a bit sort of highlighted: wealth, honour, distinction. And for him, his daughter simply becomes a foolish girl, an impediment to these abstract notions of honour for him. So he is a true tyrant who has no redeeming features at all. And on page 61, we see the consequences of this. Julia is still in the castle at this stage, and it says, she now thought she heard a footstep near her door, but presently all was still, for she believed she had been deceived by the wind. Her spirits, already weakened by sorrow, deserted her. She was seized by a universal terror. And that terror is the terror of a father forcing her into marriage with a stranger so that he can accrue wealth, honour and distinction. And it's important to note how Radcliffe uses terror to describe Julia's emotions, because that relates this tale back to an earlier Gothic novel by Horace Walpole called The Castle of Otranto, the first Gothic novel, where Walpole also uses the word terror to actually describe the plight of his young heroine Isabella, who is also being forced into an unwanted marriage. Now, I've put a little bit about the law of coverture from the most influential legal pamphlet that we've ever had, that you can still find in lawyer shelves today, William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, and his definition of coverture, that is a marital law. And as I said yesterday, coverture is a law where husband and wife become one, and essentially the woman's legal marital status is subsumed. Blackstone writes that by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law, that is, the very being or legal existence of a woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of her husband, under whose wing, protection and cover she performs everything. Now that's why it's called coverture, because it's a cover of her husband, the way that a husband can cover up his wife's identity, and the way in which her property, but also her being, is consolidated into his. And, you know, this is something that Radcliffe literalises in A Sicilian Romance, in the way that Julia fears her identity actually being usurped by an unfeeling Duke de Luovo. Now, Radcliffe, I think, presents us with a radical and refreshing vision for the year 1790. A refreshing vision that, as I said yesterday, presents us with a heroine who stands up to arbitrary tyranny, who disobeys her father, runs away from him and the suitor who she does not want, chooses with her heart her own suitor Hippolytus, you know, the young hero of the story who helps her, and also she stands up to the abate at the monastery. More radically than that, I think, is the way in which Julia discovers her mother Louisa di Bernini in what you could describe as being the womb of a castle. Ruth Bienstock, Anolik, the critic, describes this as an enactment of a reversal of childbirth. And that's me now on to slide 10. An enactment of a reversal of childbirth. Alison Milbank also reads it in this way because Louisa is discovered in a very womb-like cavernous space, and argues in her introduction to A Sicilian Romance that Julia's identification with her mother's situation is no infantile regression to the womb. Instead, it precipitates her maturation and sexual union. And I think that in many ways, this is the most compelling and radical vision of a text. The romantic ending of a text where Julia and Hippolytus are able to get together and marry, in many ways is a conservative ending, but it's the penultimate chapter and the way in which mother and daughter rediscover each other, I think that is the truly subversive part of the story. Radcliffe tags on the romantic conservative ending to the story in order to conform to conventions of fiction in 1790. But in the penultimate chapter, Julia says to her mother, "Oh, let me lead you to light and life." And there's a sense that, as Milbank reads it, Julia is delivering her mother from tyranny and terror. The young generation is rescuing the older generation who lack the confidence to be independent women. And I think that that's why, for me, this is a tale that holds particular resonance and radicalism for me, because it presents us with such a feisty heroine who really fights for what she believes in. Now, I hope you enjoyed the novel, and if you're interested in reading further on it, I've provided a full bibliography at the end of this lecture and also at the end of the previous one, and there's plenty of books and articles that you can read upon Ann Radcliffe in general, and also more specifically upon A Sicilian Romance. So enjoy, and feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.